Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got another 6-album roundup for you this time around, and we're looking at a few albums I've been listening to the past month and a half or so. These are meant to be kind of like just superficial observations on the album, some first glances. Some of them have been listened to a little bit longer than others, but generally speaking, they're albums that are new to me, not necessarily new this year. So for example, this first one, Bad Brains, Eye Against Eye, as an album was released in 1986. And I knew about Bad Brains back then, but I didn't have a really super good impression of them. Again, I was kind of in a prog rock snob moment during that time in my life. And although I was listening to Living Colour and I was listening to Fishbone, I was starting to understand that there's a lineage of black rock music that goes back a little ways. But I kind of stopped at Fishbone, stalled out there, and didn't really follow it too much further. Bad Brains were going to be the next step in that sequence. And going back looking at black rock, because they predate Fishbone and Living Colour by a bit. They started in the late 70s doing what they're doing. And here's an interesting thing. Just last week I was talking about Miles Davis's Britches Brew and about how it has had this impact, this kind of lasting impact in perhaps black music. And come to find out that Bad Brains kind of has an influential tie to Britches Brew because they initially set out to be a jazz fusion band. And the guys in the group looked at groups like Return to Forever and the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Weather Report as bands that they wanted to emulate. Of course, people who were in those bands, Joseph Zawinul, John McLaughlin, those guys were all people that played on Bitches Brew. So they had this stuff influence into Bad Brains. But Bad Brains ended up definitely not being a jazz rock group. They took a turn towards hardcore in the late 70s and made a bunch of albums. Their whole history is very, very interesting, very, very convoluted, with lots of interesting interactions between the members of the band. But Eye Against Eye is kind of when their vision kind of came together. They'd made about 2 or 3 albums up to this point, and this is the one where it sort of popped into focus for them. And what I think is really fascinating about this, first of all, lots of great performances on this, and the songs have this sort of subtle musicality to them, that if you listen to the way that they build the riffs, if you listen to the way that they play with rhythms, there's a deeper musical skill going on than would seem, superficially speaking, on a hardcore band, especially a hardcore band late 70s, early 80s. One of the things that's appealing about this album to me personally too is the guitar sounds. They are definitely stuck of the time that they're in. And as a band that was trying to be like a pretty heavy thrashy band coming in from their live setting, the guitars seem very, very clean and very, very 80s. It's almost like the guy from The Fix trying to play heavy metal. Even though it dates the album in some ways, I kind of like how it makes it unique. It's its own beast because of those guitar sounds, because of the way that it's produced. The drums sound great. There's lots of other, as an example of 80s production, it's pretty good. It just doesn't fit the style so well, but somehow that makes it work even better. So I Guess High has some great tunes on it that I really love. So particularly Reignition is one of my favorite ones. I love the way the guitar lick goes in and out, has these little subtle variations that go on in the riff, and just the rhythmic interplay on that song is pretty great. So Bad Brains, Eye Against Eye. Okay, next up is Sault's Untitled, Black Is. This is an interesting British collective who's kind of retained a degree of anonymity as far as their actual images of the people in the group. They've kept a very low profile despite getting quite a bit of acclaim. And also being extremely prolific. In the past year, they've released 2 really successful EPs and just now, as of now, 2 full albums. This album was released on Juneteenth, and that was no mistake. Sault has a very socially aware aspect to their music. And this album, as well as I think the new one that's supposed to be coming out, has a lot of commentary on the current state of black culture.
Show fear, even in my eyes. I will always rise in wildfires. I ain't never been scared, even through
What's really interesting too is how they kind of allude to the African diaspora within their music as well. You know, the Black Monument Ensemble did something similar with an album that I got earlier this year, where they try to kind of catch different aspects of Black culture in their music and build it into a different kind of more pastiche version. But I think that Sault kind of does this more convincingly. Untitled runs the gamut of being from like almost doo-wop songs, some R&B, even into some like African high life style pieces on there. So lots of different Black styles that Sault uses in their overall texture. All right, my next one is Johann Johansson's IBM 1404 user's manual. So Johann Johansson, I got into it about 2-3 years ago with the Arrival soundtrack, and really got fascinated with not only his soundtrack work, but also sort of his solo catalog. And shortly after that, I'd gotten Orphée, which is an album that I still kind of come back to more and more. I love his very identifiably Icelandic style that he has. It has that open vastness. You can hear a connection between what he does and like what Sigur Rós does in a different manifestation, but the same kind of texture. And this is one of his earlier albums, 2006, I believe his fourth album. And I'm of the mind that if you are able to make a moving piece of music about a user's manual to an outdated computer, you've got some talent going on. This album is a tribute to one of the first computers that was ever brought to Iceland, and a large IBM computer. And his father, Johann Johansson's father, was a person who for a while maintained these machines. And at one point in time, actually found a way to record these kind of musical interactions within the workings of the computer. And some of these tapes evolved into something that Johann Johansson is doing, using on this album as kind of background tape experiments, because Johann Johansson's well known for crossing the boundaries between sort of more classical chamber styles and more electronic styles. So things get very kind of cyborg with him, you know, kind of half machine, half live all the time. He's very good at mixing these textures together. And that's one of the things that holds this album together, much like his other works. Now, I will say there's some parts in here that are a little bit distracting, although they still end up being very effective. Track 2, for example, of the second movement, is basically a person reading the user's manual with this kind of chime going boom every time he finishes one of the commands. And initially it seems very avant-garde. But as the song progresses, it's very interesting way that Johann Johansson is able to play with texture, and really almost entirely texture. You can't sing any of the melodies really that are happening in any of these songs, but the texture, the way he uses the texture against the text in that one, even in the end, evolves into something that's quite emotionally effective, I think. So great disc, another great entry into my collection of Johann Johannsson's music. I think that I'll probably continue to peruse further in the coming months. All right, next up is Tiger Moth Tales, Storytellers Parts 1 and 2. Tiger Moth Tales is the brainchild of a multi-instrumentalist named Pete Jones. And Pete Jones is a guy that's backed Francis Dunnery as one of his sidemen, and also was participated in more recent touring versions of Camel. Pete Jones is blind. He's a blind musician, but he covers all the instruments in Tiger Moth Tales. It's pretty much his pet project is the Tiger Moth Tales discography. And I hadn't heard any of the other stuff. He had kind of been on my radar. It's shown up a couple times, and I always kind of was of the mind that if I felt like taking the plunge on some real classic sounding progressive rock, that I would give Tiger Moth Tales a shot. And independent of that, he was suggested to me by a viewer. So I whetted my appetite a little bit. And my earlier investigations into Brilliance has brought that my love for that style of music a little bit more to the fore too. So it seemed like a nice time to check it out. The concept of the album is that he wants to do short form progressive rock style songs on children's stories and fairy tales. And that opens up the door to some very interesting avenues, some of which are kind of almost like prog for kids, but also some things that are very fantastical and very whimsical.
Standing on the front steps of my ancestral hall, built by my forefathers, courageous heroes all.
And it works out for him well because he references so strongly 70s Genesis that he can kind of play off of Peter Gabriel's kind of storytelling, surreal, self-effacing persona that he used on stage. So there are several songs on here that feel like they could be almost like the narrative for a puppet show. And there could be a little bit silly, but musically, again, they're very, very, very brilliant. And then on the other hand, he also has many songs on here on this, especially on the second half, Storytellers Part 2. Some super hooky, melodic playing, very high energy and aggressive, progressive rock style. Definitely in that 70s vein. Kind of on the lighter side, not a whole lot of grit there. But man, some well-composed stuff and incredibly played if you take into account that he played pretty much everything on the album. So Tiger Moth Tales, Storytellers Parts 1 and 2, enjoyable, but definitely a niche audience for this one. You know, there's some hokey stuff as far as progressive rock goes, and if you're willing to accept that, there's a lot to like about this album. All right, next up is Aiming for Enrike's Music for Working Out. This was a suggestion by a viewer, and it's turned out to be a really engaging listen. I really like this one a lot. This is a Norwegian duo who, guitar player and the drummer. But I say guitar player, he's actually like a guitar player whose real virtuosity is not just in playing guitar, but in pedals and looping. This band is an amazing amount of work with just having two members in it. And it's at first, you have this sense that I wish you had people covering all these parts because they're very complex, very layered, very math rocky type patterns. But then you have to consider that he's crafting all this stuff on the fly. There's video footage out there of him playing and recording his own licks and putting them on top of each other and manipulating pedal boards along with the drummer. So it's a different kind of virtuosity that makes this sort of thing happen, but really it's no less interesting and no less compelling. The energy on this album has caused me to think a lot of like early 80s new romantic style music. It's almost like what if Duran Duran was a math rock band. It has that kind of energy, it's bubbly, it's almost danceable, but at the same time, it's really, really complex and very, very layered. Actually hangs its hat on having very distinctive melodies and great guitar sounds that harken back to that sort of glassy reverb style that you heard in a lot of 80s music, but much bigger and much with a different kind of edge to it than was available back then through that kind of technology. So Aiming for Enrike's Music for Working Out ended up being kind of a surprise favorite of mine. I've been enjoying listening to it a whole lot. And definitely going to be, I think, spinning it for a while because it's got something that gets me for sure. And finally, The Flaming Lips, American Head. Now, here's an admission. I've been a Flaming Lips fan since pretty much 2000. Soft Bulletin got me. I've been following them ever since quite avidly. But I will say that there's a point about 5 or 6 years ago that I really felt like the Flaming Lips had jumped the shark. And I was sort of like getting the sense that they were being weird just for the sake of being weird. The good news is that American Head is easily the best album I think they've made since at least 2010. And I've been wanting to say that since 2010. It's an environment in which John Lennon's Imagine and Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon can cohabitate. One of the things that the Flaming Lips have kind of gotten away from in recent years is really grounding their their lyrics in something in the more everyday, you know. And they're a psychedelic rock band, and they have had many flights of fancy in their songs, and they're definitely kind of a cosmic feel to them. But things like the Soft Bulletin had songs that were a little bit more about everyday life. And that's what American Head really kind of gets back to, I think.
And there goes floating around your bed. Here it said, now all your friends are dead.
The lyrics and the melodic approach seem a lot more direct and more honest than they've done in a while. The album is bound together by a relatively clear concept. Late 70s slacker culture kind of, but still also very cosmic and still very psychedelic, and still has that grand feel that the Best Flaming Lips music has. So for many people are pointing to this album as a return to form, and I would kind of concur with that assessment. If you've been waiting for the Flaming Lips to kind of do something that really is you don't have to reach too far to see how it touches you, I think American Head might be your re-entry point for the group. So that's all I got for you guys this week. I really appreciate you hanging around and watching. If you like the video, of course, please like and subscribe and share it out. Most importantly, don't forget to support these artists during this time. Bandcamp's been doing this first Friday of every month. They do all their proceeds to the artists that you purchase from. And please leave comments in the comments, and I will be getting back to you next week with whatever I'll be listening to. And until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.